The Use and Abuse of Logic, by Madsen Pirie, is a guide to using and abusing logic in order to win arguments. It identifies with devastating examples all the most common fallacies popularly used in argument and shows how simultaneously to strengthen your thinking and identify the weaknesses in other people's arguments. Additionally, the book shows how to be deliberately illogical and get away with it. In the chapter, Affirming the Consequent, Pirie introduces the logical fallacy of affirming the consequent, also known as the reverse of modus ponens. It asserts that if A occurs, then B must occur, and if B occurs, then A must occur as well, which is an invalid inference. Pirie explains that this fallacy is particularly effective in disguising invalid inferences within apparently plausible reasoning. Therefore, it is essential to recognize and avoid affirming the consequent in order to maintain logical coherence and win arguments soundly. An example of affirming the consequent is as follows. Premise 1, if it is raining, the ground is wet. Premise 2, the ground is wet. Conclusion, therefore, it must be raining. This is an example of invalid reasoning because there are multiple reasons why the ground could be wet, such as if someone spilled water on it or if there was condensation. Therefore, the conclusion that it is raining is not necessarily true. Affirming the consequent is a fallacy that can lead to incorrect conclusions being drawn and must be avoided in logical arguments and rational thinking. In the chapter Apriorism, Pirie introduces the concept of a priori reasoning, which is a type of reasoning based on knowledge or assumptions that do not come from experience or observation. Pirie explains that apriorism is vulnerable to criticism because it can lead to incorrect conclusions when one fails to consider empirical evidence. An example of a prioristic reasoning is as follows. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, therefore, Socrates is mortal. In this example, the conclusion is based on a priori reasoning, because it does not rely on any empirical evidence. Instead, the conclusion is reached through philosophical argumentation. In the chapter, Damning the Alternatives, Pirie advises against using a fallacious argument called damning the alternatives. This is when one attempts to support an argument by showing that all other possible options are flawed, and therefore, the argument presented must be true by default. Pirie cautions against using this tactic, as it is a fallacy that does not provide any substantive support for one's argument. Instead, to win arguments, one must provide evidence to support the argument positively, rather than simply showing that other possible options are lacking. Furthermore, Pirie suggests that the strengths of alternative arguments should be identified and addressed before making one's own argument. Only by doing so can one present a compelling case rather than a weak defense of an unsound argument. Here's an example of the argument from Damning the Alternatives. Person A, we should invest in Company X stock. Their product is the best in the market. Person B, but the product has many negative user reviews. Person A, that doesn't matter because Company Y and Company Z's products are worse, and there aren't any other companies worth investing in. In this example, Person A is attempting to support their argument for investing in Company X stock by attempting to show the alternative products and companies are worse. However, this tactic of damning the alternatives is a fallacy of reasoning because it does not provide evidence to support the argument positively. Instead, Person A should provide evidence to show why Company X is a good investment, rather than trying to show that other options are worse by default. Certainly. In How to Win Every Argument, Pirie discusses the fallacy of dicto simpliciter, also known as the sweeping generalization. This fallacy occurs when an argument is based on a single unqualified generalization that is applied too broadly or without exception. For example, an argument like all politicians are corrupt is a dicto simpliciter fallacy, because not all politicians are corrupt. Fallacies like dicto simpliciter. By using accurate data and verifiable facts, one can present a stronger and more convincing argument. In the chapter called Hedging, Pirie mentioned that hedging is a way of making an argument less vulnerable to criticism. It involves incorporating qualifications and exceptions to an argument which can reduce the risk of it being undermined by counterexamples. One example of hedging in use is when someone says, "The weather forecast says it's going to rain," but they're often wrong. This way, if it does rain, then the speaker can take credit for predicting it, but if it doesn't rain, then they can argue that they never said it definitely would. While hedging can make an argument seem more reasonable and thoughtful, it can also be misused to make an argument so equivocal and vague that it becomes meaningless and weak. Pirie suggests that people should use hedging where appropriate but must take care to ensure it does not become a smokescreen to evade criticism. Overall, Pirie advises that to win arguments, one should be concise, precise, and avoid using hedging as a way to shield one's argument from criticism. Arguments should be presented clearly with evidence to support the core position while allowing opponents to critique and engage with the argument. In a chapter that follows, Pirie discusses the fallacy of loaded words. This fallacy is a rhetorical tactic that manipulates people's emotions through the deliberate use of biased, emotive, and prejudiced language. It occurs when words are used that are calculated to conjure up a more favorable or hostile attitude, rather than presenting the unadorned facts. An example of loaded words is the use of language in political discourse. For instance, one politician may make statements such as, "We need to protect our country from dangerous immigrants," implying that all immigrants are dangerous. The word dangerous is loaded because it conjures an emotional response instead of an objective evaluation of the facts. Pirie cautions that the use of loaded language can be a powerful but unethical way of influencing people's beliefs. He advises against the use of this tactic and suggests that people should avoid biased language and stick to the facts. By using neutral and objective language, one can make a more rational and convincing argument, rather than relying on a fallacy. Ultimately, to win arguments, one should avoid loaded language and focus on providing verifiable facts and evidence to support their position. Arguments should be based on reason and logic, not on emotional appeals or biased language. Pirie in his book also discusses the fallacy of petitio principii, or begging the question. This fallacy happens when the conclusion is assumed in the premise, making the argument circular and assuming the truth of a proposition by the very fact that it was used to prove it. This can be seen as stating the same idea in different words, without providing any additional evidence or explanation. An example of the fallacy of petitio principii: "I am an intelligent person because I know that I am smart." Here, the conclusion that the person is intelligent is already assumed in the premise, making the argument circular and lacking any additional evidence or explanation to validate the claim. This fallacy is often used as a shortcut to make an argument appear more persuasive by repeating the point that is to be proven. However, such an approach only works on those who accept the initial premise, without questioning the underlying assumptions. To avoid petitio principii, it is essential to provide a sound argument with premises that can support the conclusion without relying on circular reasoning. One should put forward evidence and solid arguments to support their assertions and avoid relying solely on the repetition of the conclusion as proof. By doing so, one can craft an argument that is both effective and factually grounded. In the book, Pirie discusses also the fallacy of poisoning the well. This fallacy happens when one attacks the credibility of the opponent before they can present their case, thereby dismissing their argument out of hand without any consideration. An example of poisoning the well is when a politician, before the other candidate has a chance to speak, accuses them of being corrupt, lazy, or incompetent. This assertion aims to make people view the opponent negatively from the outset and prejudge their argument even before it is presented. Pirie cautions that this fallacy is often used as a way of winning arguments without using reason and evidence. Rather, it serves to influence the audience's perceptions and manipulate their emotions. To avoid this fallacy, Pirie suggests that one should focus on the argument made by the other person and not prejudice their credibility by attacking them beforehand. By sticking to the facts and rationally analyzing the argument presented, one can present a sound argument that outstrips fallacious dirty tactics. Ultimately, to win arguments, one should avoid poisoning the well and focus on the content of the argument presented instead of attacking the speaker. By doing this, one can present a more sound, persuasive argument that is grounded in facts, and not perpetuate fallacious tactics. In the next chapter, Pirie discusses the fallacy of the runaway train. This fallacy happens when one takes an argument to its extremes to generate a sense of panic or fear, which makes people accept the conclusions. An example of the runaway train fallacy is when someone says that, if we don't buy this car today at this price, we will never get another one again, and we will be stranded without transportation. This statement is an extreme version of the argument, meant to generate fear and urgency, even if it is not entirely true or accurate. Pirie warns that this type of argument can lead to people making bad decisions, as they are forced into decisions hastily, rather than analyzing the situation rationally. To avoid the runaway train fallacy, Pirie suggests that one should avoid accepting the argument without examining the actual facts and questioning the truth of the statement. By keeping a rational approach and analyzing the situation slowly, one can make better decisions that are not clouded by emotions. The key to winning arguments is by presenting evidence that is rooted in reason and facts, rather than being swayed by undue emotions and fear. By doing so, you can avoid the runaway train fallacy by examining the situation in its totality and not accepting quick, fallacious arguments. In Trivial Objections chapter, the author discusses this fallacy that occurs when an argument is dismissed on the basis of an objection that is technically correct but insignificant and irrelevant to the overall point. An example of trivial objections is when someone says, "Your argument about stopping pollution is invalid because you have a typographical error in your report." This objection is technically correct, but it does not affect the overall claim being made, which is to prevent pollution. Pirie argues that trivial objections can be used maliciously to manipulate listeners into thinking that the claim being made is invalid when, in fact, it is not. It can also be an easy way for someone to avoid engaging with the essential substance of an argument. To overcome trivial objections, Pirie suggests focusing on the importance and relevance of the argument being presented and not getting bogged down in minor, insignificant details. One should respond by asking questions, analyzing the objection, and clarifying the relevance or irrelevance of the objection. And in his last chapter, Pirie discusses the fallacy of wishful thinking. This fallacy happens when someone assumes that a conclusion is true because they want it to be true, or because they believe it would be beneficial if it were true, without any reference to evidence or reason. An example of wishful thinking is a person who believes that they will win a lottery ticket even though it is statistically improbable. They want to win so much that they persuade themselves that they have a good chance, despite the overwhelming evidence saying that their odds of winning are exceedingly low. Pirie warns that wishful thinking can lead to believing in irrational concepts that are not useful or beneficial for society and that can cause foolish and disastrous decisions. To avoid wishful thinking, Pirie suggests being impartial and avoiding one's biases in reasoning. One must stick to facts and consider the evidence, however disappointing it may be, to arrive at sound judgments. Ultimately, winning arguments depends on reason and fact-based evidence, not on wishful fantasies. By separating one's hopes and desires from reality, one can have a more accurate and appropriate judgment that won't lead to fallacies like wishful thinking.